My name is Hannah Lewis, and I'm 32 years old. I work as a freelance data analyst in Fairbrook, a mid-sized city where everyone knows everyone else's business, but somehow manages to miss the things that actually matter. I've always been the invisible one in my family, the reliable daughter who never caused drama, never demanded attention, never required rescue operations. That invisibility, I thought, was my superpower. Until the night I realized it had become my prison. The dining room felt smaller than usual that evening, the mahogany table my mother had inherited from her grandmother somehow shrinking under the weight of unspoken expectations. Margaret Lewis, my mother, was serving her famous pot roast while my father, Edward, pontificated about the declining state of customer service in modern America. Emily, my 26-year-old sister, was scrolling through her phone, occasionally laughing at something on her screen while completely ignoring the conversation. This was our monthly family dinner, a tradition that had somehow survived my parents' divorce and subsequent remarriage to each other, my sister's various romantic catastrophes, and my own steady withdrawal from the family orbit. I sat in my usual spot, the chair that faced the kitchen door, the one where I could easily excuse myself if needed, and watch the familiar dance of family dysfunction play out. "Hannah, honey, you're so quiet tonight," Mom said, though her attention was already drifting back to Emily, who had just started another story about her latest audition for some commercial that would probably never air. "I'm fine," I replied, the automatic response I'd been giving for as long as I could remember. Fine was safe. Fine didn't require follow-up questions. Fine was invisible. Dad cleared his throat in that way that meant he was about to make an announcement. "Actually, we wanted to talk to you about something. Hannah, about your apartment." My fork paused midway to my mouth. I'd been living in a one-bedroom apartment in downtown Fairbrook for 3 years, a space I'd carefully curated to be exactly what I needed: quiet, organized, mine. It was the first place I'd ever lived that felt like home rather than a temporary arrangement. "We've been thinking," Mom continued, glancing at Emily, who was now paying attention for the first time all evening, "that it might be good for Emily to stay at your place for a while, just until she gets back on her feet after the breakup with Trevor." Emily's latest relationship had ended dramatically, as they always did. Trevor had been an aspiring musician with commitment issues and a tendency to disappear for days at a time. The breakup had been messy, public, and entirely predictable to everyone except Emily. "She's already moved in," Dad added casually, as if he was mentioning the weather. "We gave her the spare key last week." The words hung in the air like smoke. I set my fork down carefully, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "I've been gone from that apartment for 7 weeks. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet of a family dinner. This was the silence of people realizing they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Mom's mouth opened slightly, her eyes darting between me and Emily. Dad's face went through several expressions before settling on confusion. Emily, for her part, had gone completely still, her phone forgotten in her lap. "What do you mean, gone?" Mom asked, her voice smaller than usual. "I mean I moved out 7 weeks ago." I reached for my purse, pulled out my phone, and showed them the timestamp on a photo of an empty apartment. I left the keys on the counter and moved my things out while Emily was at work. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Emily recovered first, her face flushing with anger. "You didn't tell me you were leaving." "I didn't tell any of you a lot of things," I said, my voice steady and calm in a way that seemed to unnerve them more than shouting would have. "For instance, I didn't tell you that Emily had been living in my apartment for 3 months, not 3 days. I didn't tell you that she'd been throwing parties while I was trying to work from home. I didn't tell you that she cost me a $25,000 contract because she decided to host a live stream party the night before my biggest presentation of the year." The story spilled out of me in careful, measured sentences. I told them about the night Emily had shown up at my door, mascara streaking down her cheeks, dragging a suitcase and a garbage bag full of clothes. How she'd promised it would just be for a few days while she figured things out. How those few days had stretched into weeks, then months. I described how my apartment had transformed from a sanctuary into a circus. Emily had rearranged my furniture to create better content creation spaces for her social media accounts. She'd invited friends over without asking, used my kitchen as a backdrop for cooking videos, and somehow managed to make my quiet, organized life feel chaotic and overwhelming. She was using my home as a set for her online presence, I continued, watching their faces carefully. She had ring lights set up in my living room, a tripod in my bedroom, and she'd moved my grandmother's bookshelf to create a cute study corner background for her videos. The night that broke me had been a Tuesday. I'd been preparing for a presentation to a potential client, a tech startup that needed comprehensive data analysis for their expansion plans. It was the kind of project that could have set me up financially for months. I'd been working on it for weeks, refining every detail, rehearsing every slide. Emily had decided that Tuesday night was perfect for hosting what she called a breakup celebration party. She'd invited 15 people to my apartment without mentioning it to me. I'd come home from a preparatory meeting to find my living room full of strangers, my kitchen covered in empty bottles, and my carefully organized workspace buried under purses and jackets. I asked her to keep it down, I told my parents, my voice still eerily calm. I had a presentation at 8 the next morning. She laughed and said I needed to learn to have fun. The party had gone until 3 in the morning, my neighbors had complained, my building's management had issued a warning, and I'd spent the night in my car trying to finish my presentation on my laptop while running on fumes and caffeine. The next morning, exhausted and unprepared, I'd bombed the presentation. The client had gone with someone else. So I asked her to leave, I said, looking directly at Emily. Do you remember what you said? Emily's face had gone pale, but she lifted her chin defiantly. I said you were being dramatic, that you needed to learn to share. You said I was pathetic. You said I had no life anyway, so what difference did it make if you used my apartment? You said I should be grateful to have some excitement in my boring existence. The words had cut deeper than any physical wound, not because they were particularly cruel, but because they revealed how Emily, how all of them, really saw me. I was the reliable one, the one who didn't need things for herself, the one who existed to provide stability and support for everyone else's chaos. I called both of you, I said, turning to my parents. I explained the situation. I asked for help. The phone calls had been brief and unsatisfying. Mom had suggested I was being selfish, that Emily was going through a hard time and needed family support. Dad had said I was making a big deal out of nothing, that I should just be patient and understanding. Neither of them had seemed to grasp that I was drowning in my own life, that the home I'd worked so hard to create was being systematically dismantled. You told me to work it out among ourselves, I continued. You said Emily needed me more than I needed privacy. You said I was being petty. After those phone calls, I'd sat in my apartment, Emily's apartment, really, and realized that I had become a supporting character in my own life. Worse, I'd become a supporting character that nobody even bothered to write lines for. So I'd started planning my exit. The process had been methodical and quiet, just like everything else about me. Over the course of 2 weeks, I'd secretly packed my most important belongings, clothes, documents, my laptop, the few items that held sentimental value. I'd moved them to a storage unit across town, paying for a year in advance. I'd reached out to Mason Torres, a college friend who lived in Riverbend, a suburb about 40 minutes from Fairbrook. Mason was a high school teacher who'd been going through his own divorce and had a spare bedroom he wasn't using. He'd agreed to let me stay with him temporarily while I figured out my next steps. The night I left, Emily had been out with friends. I'd finished packing my final suitcase, left my keys on the kitchen counter along with a note that simply said, "The apartment is yours now. Take care of it." Then I'd driven to Mason's house and disappeared from my family's radar entirely. For 3 weeks, I told them, nobody called, nobody texted, nobody seemed to notice I was gone. That silence had been the most revealing part of the entire experience. In the absence of my family's drama, I'd been able to think clearly for the first time in months. I'd realized that I'd been living my life in the margins, always accommodating, always adjusting, always making myself smaller to make room for everyone else's needs. But I hadn't been idle during those weeks. I'd been watching. I installed a security camera in the apartment before I left, I said, watching Emily's face go from pale to gray. Hidden behind the books on the shelf that used to be Grandma's. The camera had been a small investment that had paid enormous dividends. I'd watched Emily transform my apartment into her personal studio, complete with professional lighting and backdrop screens. I'd watched her sell my belongings, my Bluetooth speaker, my old laptop, my acoustic guitar, to fund her various projects. Most damning of all, I'd watched her forge my signature on multiple documents, including a lease renewal and several letters to the building management addressing noise complaints and maintenance issues. "I have footage of you selling my grandmother's watch," I said to Emily, whose face had now gone completely white. "The one she left me in her will. You sold it to a pawn shop for $300 to pay for a ring light." The betrayal of selling my grandmother's watch had been the final straw. That watch had been the only thing I'd owned that connected me to my family's history. A tangible link to a woman who had loved me unconditionally. Emily had sold it like it was costume jewelry. "I also have footage of you bringing strangers into the apartment, of you going through my mail, of you using my credit card to order food delivery." I'd been documenting everything, building a case with the patience and attention to detail that had made me successful in my career. "You were stalking me," Emily said, her voice shaking with anger rather than shame. "I was protecting my interests," I replied, since nobody else seemed interested in doing so. The evidence I'd gathered had been comprehensive. I'd compiled videos, screenshots, receipts, and witness statements. I'd documented every violation of my privacy, every theft of my property, every forgery of my signature. I'd presented it all to my landlord, Donald Nolan, in a neat portfolio that painted a clear picture of tenant fraud and property damage. Mr. Nolan had been apologetic and decisive. Emily had been given 48 hours to vacate the premises. The lease, which had indeed been fraudulently renewed, was terminated immediately. The security deposit I'd paid 3 years earlier was returned to me in full, along with compensation for the documented theft of my belongings. The eviction process took exactly 2 days, I said, watching my parents' faces as they began to understand the scope of what had happened. "During that time, all of you called me repeatedly. I didn't answer. The calls had been frantic. Emily had left voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to screaming accusations. My parents had tried a more measured approach, asking me to be reasonable and work something out. But I'd been reasonable for 32 years, and it had gotten me exactly nowhere. Instead, I'd hired a lawyer and filed a formal complaint with the building management company. I'd submitted insurance claims for the stolen items. I'd documented everything with the methodical precision of someone who had finally decided to stop being invisible. "I sent you all a registered letter," I continued, reaching into my purse and pulling out a manila envelope. It contained copies of all the evidence, a complete inventory of stolen items, and a formal demand for restitution. I placed the envelope on the table between us. It landed with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the silence. "This is insane," Emily said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You can't just spy on family." "Feh, I wasn't spying on family," I replied. "I was documenting crimes committed in property I was legally responsible for." The legal language felt like armor, protecting me from the emotional manipulation that had controlled me for so long. I'd learned to speak in facts rather than feelings, to present evidence rather than make accusations. "Hannah, honey," Mom said, her voice taking on the placating tone she used when she was trying to manage a situation. "Surely we can work this out. Emily made some mistakes, but she's family." "Mistakes?" I asked, my voice still calm but carrying a new edge. "Mom, she stole from me. She committed fraud. She destroyed my ability to feel safe in my own home. Those aren't mistakes. They're choices." I stood up from the table, my movements deliberate and unhurried. "I've made some choices too. I've chosen to prioritize my own well-being over family harmony. I've chosen to hold people accountable for their actions rather than making excuses for them. I've chosen to stop being invisible. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd never learned properly. But they also felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in years. "Where are you living now?" Dad asked, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Somewhere safe," I replied. "Somewhere where I can work without interruption, where I can rebuild the career that was damaged by this situation, where I can exist without having to justify my right to exist." I'd found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood near Riverside Park. It was smaller than my previous place, but it was mine in a way that felt profound and unshakable. I'd furnished it slowly, carefully, choosing each piece for its function and meaning rather than its potential as a backdrop for someone else's life. "Can we see you?" Mom asked, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Can we fix this?" I looked at my family, really looked at them, for what felt like the first time in years. I saw the panic in their faces, the confusion, the desperate scramble to understand how the reliable daughter, the invisible one, had suddenly become the person holding all the cards. "I don't know," I said honestly. "That depends on whether you're willing to see me as someone whose needs matter, whose boundaries deserve respect, whose life has value beyond what I can provide for everyone else." Emily stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous. You're being vindictive and cruel. All I did was need help, and you're treating me like a criminal." "You are a criminal," I said, my voice still maddeningly calm. "You committed theft, fraud, and property damage. The fact that you're my sister doesn't change the legal reality of what you did." "I'm your sister," Emily shouted, finally losing control. "That's supposed to mean something." "It did mean something," I replied. "It meant I let you walk all over me for months. It meant I prioritized your feelings over my own safety and security. It meant I made myself invisible so you could shine brighter." I picked up my purse and walked toward the door, my family's voices rising behind me in a cacophony of protests and pleas. But I didn't turn around. "Hannah, wait," Dad called out. "We can figure this out. We can make it right." I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. "You had months to make it right. You had dozens of opportunities to listen, to help, to show that you cared about my well-being. You chose not to take any of them." "We didn't know," Mom said, her voice breaking. "We didn't understand how bad it was." "You didn't want to know," I corrected. "There's a difference." I opened the door and stepped out into the cool evening air. Behind me, I could hear the explosion of voices, Emily crying, my parents arguing, chairs scraping, doors slamming. But for the first time in years, none of it was my problem to solve. The drive back to my apartment was quiet and peaceful. I took the long way, through the part of town where the old oak trees formed a canopy over the street, where the houses sat back from the road behind carefully tended gardens. It was the kind of neighborhood where people respected boundaries, where silence was valued rather than filled with noise. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it that morning, clean, organized, mine. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the sun set over the park. For the first time in months, I felt the deep, satisfying exhaustion of someone who had finally stopped running from her own life. 3 days later, I received a text from Emily. "I'm sorry. I know I messed up. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time, considering my options. The old Hannah would have responded immediately, would have reassured Emily that everything was fine, would have opened the door to reconciliation before any real accountability had taken place. Instead, I deleted the message and blocked her number. 2 weeks after that, a letter arrived from my mother. It was written on her good stationery, the cream-colored paper with her monogram that she saved for important correspondence. The letter was 3 pages long, filled with apologies and explanations and promises to do better. The last paragraph read, "I know you're hurt, and I know we failed you. Emily is struggling so much right now, and I'm worried about her. She keeps saying she doesn't understand why you're being so harsh. Can you find it in your heart to forgive her? Can you help us understand how to fix this?" I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. I didn't respond. The patterns were so ingrained, so automatic, that my family couldn't see them even when they were causing obvious harm. In their minds, I was still the reliable daughter who existed to provide solutions to everyone else's problems. The idea that I might have problems of my own, that I might need support and protection, was foreign to them. But I was learning to see myself differently. The freelance work that had suffered during Emily's occupation of my apartment began to recover. Without the constant stress of living in chaos, I was able to focus on my projects with renewed energy and creativity. I landed 2 new contracts in the first month after the confrontation, both with companies that valued precision and reliability, qualities that had always been my strengths. I also started therapy, something I'd been considering for years but had never made time for. Dr. Patricia Hendricks was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who specialized in family dynamics and boundary issues. She had a way of asking questions that made me examine assumptions I'd never realized I was making. "You describe yourself as invisible," she said during one of our early sessions, "but it sounds like you were very visible to your family when they needed something from you." The observation hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on feeling unseen that I'd missed the more complex reality. I was invisible when I needed support, but hypervisible when others needed my resources. "They see me as a function rather than a person," I said, the words coming out before I'd fully formed the thought. "Tell me more about that," Dr. Hendricks said. "I'm the stable one, the reliable one, the one who doesn't need things. When Emily needed a place to stay, they saw my apartment as a resource to be allocated, not as my home that I might want to protect. When she needed emotional support, they saw my tolerance as infinite, not as something that might have limits. The sessions helped me understand that my family's treatment of me wasn't personal, it was systemic. I had been cast in a role that served their needs, and they had become so comfortable with that role that they couldn't imagine me existing outside of it. But I was learning to exist outside of it. 6 months after the confrontation, I received an invitation to Emily's birthday party. It was a casual text from my mother. "Emily's having a small celebration at the house on Saturday. She'd love to see you." I studied the message, looking for any acknowledgement of what had happened, any indication that things had changed. There was none. The invitation was extended as if we'd had a minor disagreement that had blown over. As if I would naturally want to celebrate someone who had stolen from me and shown no genuine remorse. I replied, "I won't be attending. Please don't include me in future invitations unless Emily has made full restitution for the items she stole and we've had a meaningful conversation about boundaries and respect." The response came quickly. "Hannah, she's your sister. This grudge is tearing the family apart." I realized then that they would never understand. To them, my absence was the problem, not the behavior that had caused it. They wanted me to return to my role as the accommodating daughter who absorbed everyone else's chaos without complaint. But I had learned something important during those months of silence and reflection. I didn't need their understanding to maintain my boundaries. I didn't need their approval to protect my well-being. I didn't need their permission to exist on my own terms. A year after I'd left my apartment, I received a package with no return address. Inside was my grandmother's watch, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, along with a note that simply said, "I'm sorry." I held the watch in my hands for a long time, feeling its familiar weight, remembering my grandmother's gentle hands and unconditional love. The watch had been returned, but something fundamental had been broken that couldn't be repaired with gestures or gifts. I put the watch in my jewelry box and continued with my life. The new patterns I'd established became natural over time. I worked from my quiet apartment, took walks in the park, maintained friendships with people who respected my boundaries. I dated occasionally, but I was careful to choose partners who saw me as a complete person rather than a solution to their problems. I was no longer invisible because I had learned to make myself visible to the people who mattered, starting with myself. 2 years after the confrontation, I ran into Emily at a coffee shop downtown. She was sitting alone at a corner table, staring at her phone with the same distracted expression she'd worn at family dinners. She looked up as I passed, and our eyes met for a moment, Hannah, she said, her voice uncertain. Emily, I replied, not stopping. She called my name again. But I had already reached the counter. I ordered my coffee and left without looking back. I had learned that some silences were more powerful than words, that some distances were necessary for healing, that some relationships couldn't survive the transition from dysfunction to health. And I had learned that being invisible had never been my superpower, it had been my cage. But I wasn't invisible anymore, I was free.